We have our fourth speaker, who is Dr. Nick Watts. Nick is the Executive Director of the Landsat Countdown, tracking progress on health and climate change. This is an independent, multidisciplinary research collaboration between academic centres around the world. Nick's from Perth originally. He's Australian. He's a doctor trained in Perth who did population health training subsequently at the University of Western Australia and University College London. He founded the Global Climate and Health Alliance and the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change in 2016. He was the first director of the Alliance until 2018. And he's going to talk to us about his Landsat Countdown work, applying the indicators in geographically challenging regions. Nick.
My name's Nick Watts. It's very, very nice to be back in a country where everyone understands the correct pronunciation of the word data. We don't have to talk about data or data. And I have 45 minutes to talk through this, and then we have a small break, just 5 minutes up and down, and then we come back and I have another hour and a half after that. That's okay with everyone? Outstanding. The last three and a half speakers we've had have given you an excellent, and this morning as well, an excellent overview of the relationships between health and climate change, both the impacts of climate change on human health and the impacts of sort of the benefits or the risks of the response to climate change and what that might bring for human health. They get to talk about impassioned pleas and calls for action. They get to give policy guidance. I get to talk about everyone's favorite topic in high school, everyone's favorite topic all the way through medical school, statistics. I'm going to talk a little bit about counting. I'm also going to realize that I have 3 or 4 microphones, so I'm going to try not to look down so much. I talk about counting, but to help you out, I'm going to borrow a little bit of a strategy from Colin. He gave you a couple of key messages up early on so that if anyone falls asleep, at least you remember that. I had a similar experience from a surgeon somewhere in medical school in the 3rd year who said, I know that you're all going to fall asleep because this is a 3-hour lecture and no one's going to pay attention for more than 10 minutes. So here's the first 3 messages. Remember them, and these are the only things that will be in the exam. The first message, counting is hard. Counting the links between health and climate change is difficult, it's complex, and there are many, many reasons we struggle. But those reasons and all of those difficulties are amplified in the Pacific and in small island states. The second message is that there's a couple of reasons why we're getting better, largely because of efforts like Alistair, like Colin, like Maxine, like Celia, and academics and experts all around the world who are getting better at understanding those links and tracking and counting those links between health and climate change. And my third key message is that none of that really matters much if we don't do a good job of communicating it to the public, communicating it to our fellow health professionals, and presenting that data in a timely and in a useful way that policymakers can take to make decisions with. How does that sound? Is anyone asleep? Did everyone remember that? Counting's hard, we're getting better at counting, but it doesn't matter that much unless we get better at communicating it. There you go. I'm going to talk about most of this, talking through the context of a collaboration I'm familiar with, the Landsat Countdown. The Landsat Countdown does 3 things. One, we build a platform of academic institutions, of UN agencies scattered across the world, scattered across every continent. We agree on pretty much nothing. The second thing we do is we produce indicators. We produce over 40 indicators every year, and we publish them in the Lancet of different aspects of the relationship between health and climate change. We look at the lethality of weather-related disasters. We look at the extent to which hospitals and healthcare systems are adapting and are responding to the health impacts of climate change. We look at the extent to which countries are phasing out coal-fired power. Believe it or not, with the exception of Australia, many countries in the world are phasing out coal-fired power and the health benefits that they experience from that. Unfortunately, most of our indicators disagree with each other as well. And then the last thing we do with great success is produce very complex diagrams that no one particularly understands. But talking a little bit about counting. As we've heard from the first three presenters, getting better at understanding the links between health and climate change, tracking them over time, over space, over geographies is something that's urgently needed. It's urgently needed because we know that when we do a review of all of the research on health and climate change around the world, about a third of it focuses on the United States, North America. About 25% of it focuses on Europe, 10% of it focuses on China, 10% on Africa. 2.8% of global research focuses on small island developing states, and we've just heard that they are among the most vulnerable communities and populations at the forefront of the health impacts of climate change. And equally, there's a great cry out for more research, for more understanding, because as we heard from Colin, small island states, particularly in the Pacific, have been at the forefront of calling for greater action. When we analyze through the Landsat Countdown some of the indicators that look at the extent to which governments are engaging in climate change, we see that the Pacific Island states are by far and away decades ahead of the rest of the world in terms of their understanding of the links between those two issues and in terms of the actions that they're trying to take. The United States, Australia, Europe, we're decades behind in understanding these links. There are a couple of reasons why we don't count too well, why we don't count so good. When it comes to health and climate change, it's partly the fact that climate change, as we heard, undermines all of the environmental, all of the social, all of the economic, or many of the economic determinants of public health. And so when it starts to do that, we have to start to take in all sorts of things into account when we're trying to understand what the actual impact of climate change has been. Attribution to climate change is very complex. For a long time, you would have heard climate scientists say that climate change increases the frequency and the severity of an event, or the likelihood of an event going forward over the course of the century. Methods are getting much better, and we're able to assign probabilities to individual events, but that's still a very complex and costly and time-consuming sort of form of method to deploy. And so we're still not at that point where we can respond quickly enough to some of these events and understand the impact that climate change had. Attribution to health outcome is even more challenging. Going from the exposure from climate change to the climate exposure, factoring in vulnerability and ending up at health outcomes out the other side is very complex. Doing so across temporal and geographical scales, and doing so in a way that understands that climate change is inherently a global phenomena with global drivers, but at the end of the day, we're mostly interested in the local outcomes. Trying to overcome all of those challenges as it applies to the health impacts of climate change, the adaptation responses, the mitigation responses, is something that's really quite complex that we're getting better at. As it applies to small island states, there are a number of unique, small island developing states, there's a number of unique challenges that they face as well. A rough estimate from the UN Statistical Office suggests that just to get up to date with capturing all of the indicators we need for the Sustainable Development Goals, small island developing states need an additional $1 billion a year just to invest in statistics and epidemiology to better understand and be able to track all of the things that the Sustainable Development Goals are asking of them. There's a serious lack of resource dedicated to this, and we can overcome some of that with some clever satellites and some clever global monitoring, but at the end of the day, sometimes you just need some people on the ground. There are some technical complexities when it comes to understanding some of these impacts. Either it's the climate downscaling some of that climate data down to the level of the size of some of these small island states, or it's even coming up with something that understands what exactly the definition of a death is. We find that Alistair's telling me that I have another 45 minutes. We find that the definition of a death with the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, the guys that do the global burden of disease studies as it applies to extreme weather events, is taken as sort of an ICD-10 code in vital registration data corresponding to the exposure to forces of nature and disaster. It's a very narrow definition. A direct force from nature or disaster corresponding with an ICD-10 code during that period. The Sendai framework, one of the big UN processes sort of dedicated to tracking some of this, takes a much broader definition, and they fight endlessly about these definitions. Sendai comes up with a definition along the lines of the number of people who died during a disaster or directly after a disaster as a direct or an indirect result of a hazardous event. There's a serious lack of data at the core of what we're sort of trying to play with here. Getting that data out and available in a timely, in a policy relevant manner is particularly difficult. And at the end of the day, even if we did manage to do that, I'm not convinced that we're particularly good at communicating that data just yet. I think we have a long way to go. So that's my first message, with 45 minutes left to go. My first message is that counting is difficult. There's a couple of reasons, and in response to each of those challenges that I had up, I've got a slide or two. There's a couple of reasons why we're getting better. And there are reasons for optimism and reasons to think that very soon public health professionals, doctors, nurses around the world are going to have the data they need to try and begin to respond. We're starting to see big institutions step in. The Wellcome Trust, with a large program, £70 million funding research on health and climate change. That's just their little pilot, is the 70 million. The Wellcome Trust is the second largest research institute, medical research institute in the world. They're looking to multiply that by a factor of 10 going forward over the next 5 to 10 years. The Nordic Development Fund announced about a week ago 100 million dedicated to health and climate change research, dedicated to tracking and understanding the health impacts. And we're starting to see organizations like the World Health Organization step up with the health links to climate change now as one of their top 5 priorities with the new Director General. So there's new resource beginning to come into the space. We have new data sources that come with this, whether it's the 232 indicators that are coming as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai framework, which is tracking countries' exposure to extreme weather events and the mortality and the morbidity and the preparedness that comes from that, or the UN Framework Convention's global stocktake process. So there are all sorts of big new initiatives that are very shiny and starting up in the next sort of 1 to 5 years. At the end of the day, though, these guys are going to rely on some of the data that has to be collected at that local level. And so if we don't upscale some of those national statistical offices, they can do all of the drum beating they want at the global level. It needs to be sort of complemented with something from the ground up. We're starting to get better at understanding the understanding how to produce policy relevant information as well. 2 initiatives that I'm familiar with. One, a joint office between the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization, starting to help meteorological organizations produce climate data in a way that is useful for public health professionals. Too often it's out there, but a doctor or an epidemiologist doesn't quite know what to do with it because it's not prepared in a timely fashion or it's not prepared in the way that they need to make use of it. And similarly, the WHO partnership, which has already been mentioned with the UNFCCC, looking to understand the specific at a national level, the health impacts of climate change around the world. They've done 42 profiles, 42 countries. They're going to do 80 by the end of next year, and they're going to drive themselves mad trying to get there. I think this is my last slide. It is. David Pension told us early on at the start of the day, good politicians aren't leaders, they're often good followers. And I think that's an important thing to remember because the data that we're producing and the data that's coming forward from our technical agencies, from our academic experts is clearly very important, but it's not worth anything unless we get better at putting it forward in a policy relevant manner and we get better at communicating it to the stakeholders that are going to vote people into power that are going to take action on some of these issues. So that's my third key message, is that we're onto a good thing. When we get better at communicating the impacts of climate change, we're going to get better at seeing we're going to start to see some of the action that we're looking for. And we're onto a good thing because when we start to talk about climate change, not as an issue that's affecting polar bears, not as an issue that's affecting a polar bear probably somewhere in Africa, and not as an issue that's affecting polar bears probably somewhere in Africa, by the end of the century, but we start to talk about climate change as a tangible health issue that affects the health of communities within Australia, communities directly adjacent to Australia in the Pacific. We start to talk about it as something that's impacting us immediately and something that we have the ability to respond to. We have the ability to adapt to the health impacts of climate change, or we have the ability to drive some of those mitigation efforts. That's where we start to see that sort of change in the data really turn from something that is, another report on the shelf to something that mobilizes different professions, the health profession, the public. So we've tried to mess around with that. We try to put faces. In fact, at the moment, we have a videographer, we have a poet, and we have a musician wandering around Fiji, taking some of our data from the Landsat Countdown and trying to communicate that into some slightly more exciting, more engaging ways for the general public. We try and put a human face on climate change. We try very hard to do what I think is probably a simple goal, but probably difficult to do in practice, which is take all of this information, take the 300, the 800, the 900-page reports, and turn them into very simple, very clear messages and repeat them again and again and again, and find credible sources to repeat them again and again. You can never become too tired of your message. And when we do these two things, when we put a human face on climate change, and when we repeat some of these messages, we keep them simple and we repeat them again and again, we end up relatively successful. We launched a report at the end of last year in the Lancet. We had a couple of strange phenomena. We ended up trending on Twitter globally. And that was exciting, I think, because I don't have Twitter, but I'm told that that's exciting. What was more exciting to me was that we were trending on Twitter just above Batman and just below Taylor Swift. We had a strange situation where the head of the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Change Agency, was having an argument with the Hulk about our report on Twitter. And we managed to crash the Lancet's website because it had never experienced such a rush for downloads of the report. About 15,000 downloads in the hour, and then it crashed, and then we got it back up and running. We're now up to 2.9 million. As well as that, we started to see that by talking about the health impacts, by taking some of this data, talking about the health implications of some of this data, we were able to break into the mainstream of sort of public communication. And that's really what the goal is at the end of the day, is by landing on the front page of something like the Daily Mail, the newspaper in the world with the largest circulation, you end up with a total circulation of about 1.9 billion people from the report that we put out. Those are my three messages. Counting is difficult. We're getting better at counting. But if we get better at counting, but we don't get better at communicating the things that we're counting, it doesn't matter too much at all. Anyway, thank you.